Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, December 9th, 2019, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. Time traveling again this week, and by my calculations, I am just on an airplane coming home from Melbourne from what I have to assume was an incredible trip with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Yeah, but I'm actually recording this a couple of weeks in advance so that I don't have to bring my recording equipment with me halfway across the world. Guys, I'm super excited about this week's show. We get to talk to Dr. Darcy Lockman all about her newest book. But before we dive into that, I want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible each and every week to help me so that I can offer this service for free to anybody who wants to listen. So those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon, I thank you so much. Anybody who's interested, maybe, I don't know, as a holiday gift to a loved one, maybe in their name, or just as a gift to everybody listening, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy and learn all about how to support the show. This week's top patrons include Sinai, Ulrika Hagman, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Dudas Infinitas, Phil Tiber, the Zombie Drummer, David J. E. Smith, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. And one of the things that's interesting about that list, and also interesting every time I do surveys on the show, is that the vast majority of those names were men's names. Ulrika, thank you so much. And also, I don't know if Sinai is, I don't know what gender Sinai is, could be many things, but I do really, really appreciate all of the supporters and all of the listeners of the show. One thing that I've struggled with from the beginning of Talk Nerdy, I think partially because it's a science show, and also partially because podcasting itself has some gender inequities in it. But the vast majority of my listenership is male, and I think that this is going to be an eye-opening episode, an interview for many of my listeners. Hopefully my female listeners really feel heard. Hopefully my male listeners learn something new. And of course, any of my non-binary or trans listeners don't feel left out of the conversation. I think that this is a really, really important one for everybody to hear because it helps us understand some of the issues that a lot of people are facing in their marriages today. So Dr. Darcy Lockman, she's actually a clinical psychologist who worked as a journalist, and now she writes books. She still works as a clinical psychologist, but I think a lot of her journalism expertise fed into this book, her newest book, because she interviewed a lot of people and really got down to the heart of some of the issues that they deal with. So the book is called All the Rage: Mothers, Fathers, and the Myth of Equal Partnership. Yes, I said rage. Yes, I said myth. We're going to dive into all of that right now. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Darcy Lockman. Darcy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Cara. Thank you for having me.
Of course, I'm really looking forward to this chat. At first blush, I think it looks like your book is kind of a different fit for my show since it's mostly a science show. Lately, I've been doing more psychology and social science topics. And this is much more of I would say a social justice topic, written though by a clinical psychologist. And so how much of your book comes from you and how much of it comes from your work?
Oh, gosh. Well, I would say almost none of it comes from my work as a therapist. I mean, the conception of a book was all about my personal experience and kind of coming up against frustration around just kind of taking care of everything at home without my husband and I meaning for it to be that way. And there was a lot of conflict between us about this when our kids were young. And I also saw all the women I knew kind of living this way too and feeling really frustrated. And so the journalist in me because I was a journalist before I went back to school to be a psychologist, the journalist in me got really worked up. I had this question that I really wanted to answer. So I started digging into all the social science research around it. So it's funny because I said to my editor, before the book came out. I'm like, do we have to even mention that I'm a clinical psychologist? Because I don't want people to get the wrong idea about the book. And she was like, no, it gives you a little more gravitas. So we're gonna say that you're a clinical psychologist. I was like, all right, fine. And it's not that I'm not proud of my profession. It's just that I feel like this is not a clinical psychologist book.
Yeah, but the good news is that between your kind of experience as a journalist and then the skills that you develop as a psychologist, you actually do. Um, you're kind of in a position where you can read the academic literature about this and synthesize it
Exactly.
better.
Yes. That was the one helpful part. I knew how to read research because I had a PhD, have a PhD. So I think without that training and the degree, it would have been really hard to read all this stuff. Like I know what I can skip when I'm reading somebody's academic paper because I can like look at the paper and understand it and I can skip the stats and just not read that section and still like understand that I can get the gist of the article.
So, how long did you work as a journalist before you got into psychology? I love to kind of understand, who authors are and what they're bringing to their writing, even though you didn't kind of approach this book as a psychologist's book.
So I became a journalist in 1988 when I was in my junior year of high school. I'm
Love
kidding.
it.
But I was on my high school newspaper, and then I was editor in chief of my high school newspaper. And then I went to the University of Michigan and worked on the Michigan Daily, which is like a really good college paper. So I actually started learning to do that sort of thing pretty young. And I always loved writing, but I never wanted to be a fiction writer per se. My brain didn't work that way. So I really liked nonfiction. And then during college, as I was working at the college newspaper, I got introduced to like Joan Didion and Hunter Thompson and Norman Mailer and like all that stuff, the new journalism. And I realized that nonfiction writing could be really fun and really colorful. So I moved to New York City after college, which was 1994. And worked in magazine publishing for about 10 years. And a lot of it, I was on staff at different magazines, but I was a freelance writer off and on throughout that time. And I started to feel like so much of being a freelance writer was writing stuff that was not at all interesting to you just because you had to make a living. And after a while, I just thought, I don't think like I need something to sustain me for the next 50 years. I don't think this is going to be it for me. And I had started seeing a therapist when I moved to New York. And I just thought like what she understood about human nature was so fascinating to me. I got a lot out of therapy also in other ways, but like, it really intrigued me. So at the same time as I was thinking, this magazine writing thing is just not, I don't know if I can take it far enough to be doing interesting pieces all the time. So I decided, having developed this other interest to go back to school for that, but also thinking like I would eventually be a therapist who also wrote. So it's really nice that I've been able to do that.
Yeah, it is one of those kinds of careers, and it's something that I've thought about quite a bit. Like as a freelancer, it sort of allows you to continue to have the freelance lifestyle, which is so kind of deeply important to me.
Oh, yeah. I love being self-employed. It's been, especially as a parent, I think, such a nice thing to be able to kind of structure my own schedule. And then also when I'm writing books, I can kind of condense my therapy practice a little bit so that I'm home writing part-time and I'm in the office seeing patients part-time. It's a really nice mix of things professionally for me.
And so, this book is about rearing parents. Really, it's about partnership, but parents who rear children and what that experience is like, and who carries the weight. But you also said that your clinical practice does not feed into this book. What is your specific focus in clinical practice? You're not a couples therapist.
I am actually a couples therapist. I see adults, so I work with adults and couples, but this is not typically the main issue that brings couples to treatment. I mean, whenever I'm seeing a couple with kids, and especially young kids, this is certainly part of the conversation, but it's not like typically the focus. So while of course it was interesting because as I've gotten older, my patients have gotten older. So I'm now in the last like 5 years, let's say, much more likely to be seeing people who have kids. When I started my practice when I was 35, because I went back to school at 30, most of my patients were in their 20s, and so a lot of them didn't have kids. As I got older, and my patients, the people who came to see me started getting older, I would certainly hear from women that they were resentful and felt overloaded, and I would hear from men, my wife is angry at me all the time, and I do not understand why. So as I saw more parents, this was certainly part of the conversation, but again, never the focus. So when I say my practice didn't like feed into the book, it was more the experience I was having as a mother, and spending time with other women who were also professionals or working, and frustrated with their male partners. That was much more the impetus for the book.
And when throughout that process did you first have kids? Like, where were you in your career?
So my husband and I met in grad school. We were in the same class, and so we were together throughout school. And then we got married at the tail end of our internship year, so in the 5th year of school, and we both started our practices, um, while having like other part-time jobs that had more like reliable income in the beginning. And then we had kids. I was 35 when we got married, so we had our first daughter like pretty soon thereafter. So I was 36 when we had our first daughter, and I wasn't licensed until after she was born. So I was doing my postdoc hours when I was pregnant and around the time she was born. So it wasn't really until, even though we had some conflicts when we only had one kid, it wasn't until the second came along that I really was so overwhelmed and angry. So it was sort of like, I guess, when our oldest was 4 and our youngest was 1, that this question really started to coalesce for me. And then I didn't decide to write the book until I think our youngest was 3 when I started working. So I was like in the family stuff, in the practice stuff. And I wrote a book about my clinical internship. So I had written a book, called Brooklyn Zoo that was published by Random House, in 2012. So I kind of was, I was trying to think of new book ideas, and this question became persistent at the same time that I was like, what am I going to write next?
And so was kind of the act of writing cathartic for you? I think a lot of people think that when people write about an experience, something more autobiographical or more memoir-esque, that like all that shit is done with. I'm reflecting back on the past and these are my insights, but like you were in it while you were writing it.
Yeah, because our kids were getting older and because I was working on this book, it was something. First of all, as your kids get older, and I hear this from people, things get a little easier. Like initially, when they're completely dependent, it's so draining, especially when there's more than one. And then as they establish a little more independence, they can get themselves a glass of water, they can dress themselves. The weight comes off a little bit and things got easier. And my husband and I were in couples therapy, so that really helped a lot. Um, oh my God, I lost sight of even what question you asked me. I was in the thick of it while writing and reading all the research because the book is not a memoir. My personal story is the jumping off point, and I interviewed 50 mothers for the book, and so my stories as well as theirs are in there, but it's also really research heavy. So I was reading all this stuff about why women are so oppressed in our society, and listening to or hearing people's ideas about why that is so and why that hasn't shifted more. So it was like reading the research was kind of enraging. I would find myself getting angry. There's this idea that Roxane Gay, who's the feminist writer, essayist, novelist, writer extraordinaire, talks about. She calls it writing toward answers, like not really knowing what a solution is, but writing toward answers. And I really liked that idea. I kind of let that guide me as I worked on the book, because it wasn't like we were ever really figuring it out, but I was like writing toward answers in understanding the dilemma more precisely and fully.
Yeah, ultimately, writing about some sort of kind of systemic societal issue is not going to solve the systemic societal issue. It's going to bring eyes to it, and that's the most important thing. It's going to help people realize that maybe the status quo is only good for the people who like still have the power.
Yeah, right. The word myth is in the title. in the subtitle. And the reason that is so is that there's this idea in culture now about the modern involved father. And, it's this idea that men are so much more involved as fathers than they were in, like, the Ward Cleaver, Leave It to Beaver kind of generation. And that's not untrue. All the research supports that. But this story, this myth that we know about, leaves a big chunk out, which is the labor part, the unpaid labor stuff. And women are still largely responsible for that. They do women in dual earner couples do 65% of the childcare. Having a wife being a wife creates 7 extra hours of work a week for a woman, while becoming a husband lessens a man's workload at home by about an hour a week. So there's so much quantitative data that supports the fact that unpaid labor is still largely done by women. And we can look at it in this glass half full way, which is fathers are now more involved with their kids, which is wonderful for everybody. But that is the glass half full way of looking at it. It again leaves out the labor piece. So it was my thought, and this is kind of the premise of my work as a therapist too, that making the unconscious conscious can help us to at least make choices instead of letting things kind of default to the gendered way they go when we don't know what is likely to happen because of what is.
Yeah, I mean, it feels a little bit like sometimes when there's a bit of a social movement for change, if there's some incremental change and people report on that incremental change, or people become more aware of that incremental change, that it becomes inflated in the consciousness of most of the people in a society. Like, oh, well, everything's fine now. The pendulum swung. And it's like, no, we're not there
Right.
yet.
But in this case, it's not quite that it's inflated, it's that it's conflated. So like there's no distinction made between being like an involved father and being a good partner. And they're really two very different things.
Gotcha. So this is something I'm so excited to talk about it because it's something I care deeply about, but having no personal experience whatsoever. And I think there's a part of me that's always wondered, or I mean, I think I could probably tell somebody if they asked, but it might take a while for me to formulate my answers, that I just have no interest in getting married and never have. And I've had incredible partners and I've had, wonderful, really fulfilling relationships. But when it comes time to have that conversation, I'm like, oh yeah, that's like not what I'm in this for. And luckily for me, I think it's easier sometimes to have a male partner. When I say I don't want to ever get married, for them to be like, oh, okay, as opposed to it might be different, right? If I had a female partner, I don't know. I don't know if there are gender differences there, but I also have no interest in having kids. And I really understand why people who want to have a family and want to have children also desire the security of having an institution, of having a marriage, because it's protective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's protective and it makes you part of something larger in a way. It's like we have religious traditions, and a lot of people, myself included, who enjoy religious traditions don't really feel religious. It's just nice to be doing things that our ancestors did. I think as humans, it makes us feel connected to like the past and maybe the future. So I wonder if marriage is like, in a way, it's something like that. It's a way of feeling connected to something.
Yeah, and then but with that comes this kind of dark underbelly of the fact that when you look at the past and you look at traditions and you look at where marriage really ultimately started, it was a contract. It was about, in many ways ownership, in many ways. I mean, it's really dark.
Oh yeah, I mean, women went from being owned by their fathers to being owned by their husbands. That's exactly what marriage was, and in fact, that's the derivation of Mrs. versus Miss. Miss is a signifier that you belong to your father. Mrs. is a signifier that you belong to the Mister. I mean, it is Mister apostrophe S is Mrs. Right?
Whoa, really? Misters? Oh my
Yeah, that's one.
gosh.
That's one explanation for the derivation of the term. I mean, it does distinguish whose property, or it did once distinguish whose property a female was.
Wow. And I mean, I've always been like weird about rings too, because I feel like that's like some sort of weird symbol of like ownership, or like I'm betrothed, it's like a lot of it kind of puts a bad taste in my mouth, that there are these things that I think a lot of people view as these very positive symbols of choice, but they don't have very savory histories. And I think sometimes what ends up happening with an unsavory past is that, the fundamental um, aspects of that sort of wiggle their way into modern society still.
Yeah, the home has been called a gender factory, and I think that when people talk about gender, there's a way of talking about it being part of a social relational construct, meaning we're never so much women or men as when we're in the company of the opposite gender, and then we define ourselves by who we are, like in polarity, right? Contrasted against the other. So when you have a woman and a man living together, even if they are progressive and don't subscribe to a lot of traditional values, that stuff does start to come out. And if you read the women's studies literature or the family studies research or any of it, there is a consistent finding about couples becoming more traditional, first maybe upon marriage, but then certainly when children enter the home, even if, again, they espouse progressive values. Attitudes, it turns out, do not predict behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm kind of not surprised by that. I mean, even in my own life, I had a long-term relationship that was very progressive, and no marriage, no children, but lived in a beautiful home together, owned a home together, and he made significantly more money than I did. And I think that even those kinds of inequities in the home start to espouse or foster roles that are different, and not just in terms of behavior, but also in terms of, how would I put it, emotional responses.
Uh-huh. It's interesting that you bring up money because obviously men have traditionally out-earned women. And when that was almost always the case, there was a theory called relative resource theory in the family studies literature that espoused that women did more unpaid labor at home because they brought in less money. So, but once women actually did start out earning their husbands, and right now at this point in history, according to the Census Bureau, 38% of married women out earn their male partners. So now we're at a point where 38%, yeah. But guess what? Relative resource theory was disproven because even when women out earn their male partners, they still do more of the unpaid labor of the home, both with children and without children. So it can feel like, oh, he earns more money, that's why I'm doing more at home. But really, it was just like the gender structure, and the money was just kind of like a curtain over it that made it look like, well, it makes sense. He earns more, so I should do more at home. People could like kind of justify it, but interestingly, women who earn more. So the other thing the Census Bureau has found by comparing self-reported income to IRS reported income, women who out earn their husbands downplay how much they earn when they're reporting it. So something goes on where like women feel like they should neutralize the gender deviance, as it's called, gender deviance neutralization. Like, I'm going to say I earn less because it's really uncomfortable that I earn more than my spouse. And the men will underreport their wives' incomes too. Again, not illegal. They're not underreporting to the IRS. It's when the Census Bureau asks.
Wow. I mean, I'm not surprised. It's such a deep kind of thing. It cuts so deep in our consciousness. And I mean, like, it's this relational thing, like you said, kind of comparing ourselves to our partners, for example. But at the same time, I think it's also a societal, systemic thing where, like, women don't have like as strong negotiation skills when they are, trying to get a raise. They tend to, like, feel uncomfortable talking about money with their friends or their colleagues, and almost feel shameful if you make money. Like, oh, it's like, "Ooh, I don't wanna tell people about that."
Yeah. So there was this really disturbing study in an Ivy League MBA program, and they asked single women, partnered women, and men about their ambitions, and they like professional ambitions. And that some of the students were told that whatever they said would remain private. Some of the students in the study were told that the information collected by the study would be public. Everyone would see what they said. And the answers were consistent for the partnered women and the men in the study, no matter if it was going to be public or private. But the single women in the study, when told that their answers would be public, downplayed their professional ambitions. And these single women also participated less in classroom discussions. So even though their grades at the end of the semester were just as high as their peers, they seemed to be downplaying both their intelligence and what they wanted professionally. The single women were, and the researchers speculated this was because they didn't want to become less desirable partners. Not that they were trying to hook up with anyone in the program, but just like in general, they thought they must have had it in their heads that they had to act like they weren't super ambitious. They were just getting their MBAs, and that that could be nice and well and good and fun, but maybe they'd just like have families.
Oh, God. It's like a weird grown-up version of stereotype threat, but, like, on its ear. It's, like, so strange. And, I mean, I don't I get it, because even though usually we talk about this stuff, like you said before, making the unconscious conscious, a lot of this stuff is happening sort of below the surface. Maybe we're not consciously thinking about it. But I wonder how many women listening to this right now, or men maybe even reflecting and listening to this right now, can think back to an experience where it's like, yep, that's exactly why, I said this or I did this in that situation. I dated a very successful scientist. And I myself was very successful in my career at the time and working a lot. And I remember when we broke up and, we cared about each other, things weren't working. Some of the discussions around the breakup were very clearly, I did not expect to find myself in a position with someone like you. Unfortunately, I'm very, very attracted to your ambition. And it's probably a big part of why I like you, like how hard you work and how ambitious you are and how successful you are. But my goal is to actually marry somebody who will stay home and take care of my children. And that's not
He actually
you.
said this to you?
Oh, he was very clear about it.
Oh my
Like, he was
God.
very clear that, I'm from a small town. This is the lifestyle that I want. And it's the thing that makes me most attracted to you is the thing that makes it so that we really don't have a future. And I
Wow.
was like,
That's
wow.
amazing.
I mean, at least you're being honest
That's
with
honest.
me.
Yeah. So there was a speed dating study at Columbia, and you know what speed dating is, right? You go on a series of very, like, I don't know, 5-minute dates with a bunch of people who've also signed up for speed dating, and then at the end of the speed dating round, after you've had like these like 10 dates, you kind of you say whether you want to see the person again or not. um, it's like a pretty common social thing, this speed dating, but Columbia was doing this study. So they arranged it just like any other speed dating. And then they asked people to fill out questionnaires afterwards, rating different qualities of the person they had been on a date with. So like rating the other person's intelligence and ambition and, a bunch of other qualities, which I don't remember. And then they had to rate their own ambition and intelligence and all this stuff. And what they found when they compared what the men, who the men wanted to go out with again versus who the women wanted to go out with again, because it was all heterosexual speed dating. They found that like men didn't want dates with women they found more intelligent or ambitious than themselves, and the women did. I'm like bastardizing this study. It's in my book, and you can find it online if you want, I'm sure. But it was just, it like tells us what we already know, right? It's exactly what this guy was saying to you. Like, I like your ambition, but you're too ambitious for me. And I think women are used to making themselves small. I mean, I remember not wanting to like sound too smart in high school because I didn't think the boys would like me. And it makes me want to send my kids to an all-girls school. Like, I hope those aren't still the values that are kind of in the culture so explicitly, but I'm not sure that it's changed. This is why all-girls schools are such a good idea.
I don't think it has changed, because I think that we're still seeing, again, those stereotype threat studies, those classic studies where kids are given a test and the girls end up scoring significantly lower when they're told that this is hard for girls, but boys do well, as opposed to when they're not told anything. And, one of the things that I always bring up when people ask me about like women in STEM, and, I give a lot of talks on the subject and blah, 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 is that leaky pipeline, that kind of place where the shift starts. Because, young girls, young boys are equally scientifically curious and interested. And then there's this like late childhood, early adolescence point where girls really start to fall off in those math and science classes and engineering classes. And everybody's like, why? Isn't it just because girls are fundamentally less interested? And the truth is that no. Study after study show that with the right kind of tutoring or the right kind of training or the right kind of focused attention, they're matched in interest and in scores. But why do they need that? Why do they need that extra oomph, that extra nudge? It's because in the classroom, when assigned a math problem, a girl is more likely to say out loud, "This is too hard. I don't understand it." Whereas a boy is more likely to be like, "No, it's not. I get it." And that's socialization. That's being taught how you're allowed to say your emotions, how you're allowed to show your frustration tolerance, to verbalize if you're sad about something not making sense. Whereas boys, it's more, I think, in many ways, a problem of how we raise our boys to not show emotion, to tough it out, act like they get it, act strong even in the face of adversity, even if what they really want to do is cry or say, "I need help." We don't let them do that. And so then, girls end up seeing that kind of behavior and going, "Well, I guess it's easy for them and it's hard for me, so I'm not cut out for this."
Teacher expectation has such an impact too. There have been some really good studies with this. And so when you have teachers who probably believe that boys are better at math and science, that's going to be their expectation of their students. This plays out with race too. When you have teachers who expect that the white kids are going to do better than the kids of color, the expectation has an impact on the outcome. So there's so many layers to this that, when people say to me, "Well, how do we solve this problem of gender inequity in the home?" It's like, well, in preschool classrooms, girls are reinforced for babbling, while boys are reinforced. And when I say reinforced, I mean given attention for. Boys are reinforced for aggressive behaviors. Teachers intervene to modulate boys' aggressive behaviors like 3 times as often as with girls. Why is that so? It's because they're worried about boys' aggression. But kids like attention, so that feels, it's a reinforcing behavior. So like by the time kids are 2 and 3, boys are hitting and shoving more, and girls are babbling and talking more because they've been more reinforced for that. So it's like, how do we solve gender inequity in adult homes? I think the only way to do it is to become really conscious of our internalized sexism, because we're not going to make any shifts in this internalized sexism given these like really subtle ways that differences, supposed gender differences, I mean, they are socialized gender differences, are reinforced like all over the world in every minute of your children's lives. So as adults, we have to be really conscious of our implicit beliefs if we want to create a different sort of life for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mention that too, that these implicit beliefs, um they're not specific to the opposite gender. Like women have implicit sexism towards girls, men have implicit sexism
Yes.
towards
And towards
boys.
ourselves. I mean, I'm constantly, one of the things that I was kind of really forced to contend with in writing this book is how automatically I work to relieve my husband of any burdens he might have. Like I always think, oh, I should just take that if he looks stressed or concerned. And I heard this from so many women. You do something yourself and you think, well, this is my individual psychology, but you hear it from enough people and you realize, well, this is also socialization, right? Girls are socialized to be communal, to think about others. Boys are socialized to put their needs and priorities first, to have agency and ambition. Girls to think about others and be thoughtful and, generally speaking. So I really found myself with this internalized sexism. It's my job to make sure he's comfortable, right? It's like the old stereotype of like bringing your husband a drink after work as he kicks off his shoes. Um, and that comes from a time when there were a class of mothers who were able to stay home, able to, as if this was such a prize. A lot of women were really unhappy, as is quite well documented. But that impulse, I see it in myself. So when we talk about internalized sexism, it's not only in the way we treat our daughters, but in the way we relate to ourselves and our own priorities and needs and ambitions
And
and
those of our
values.
partner.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I have a recurring experience in relationships. And again, I'm saying this coming from a position where I am generally engaged in incredibly progressive relationships with amazing people. I actually, maintain friendships with a lot of the people. I feel like I have to caveat this because I'm like, oh, if anybody knows,
I know,
my
I know, I
partners,
know.
then they're going to be like, oh, no, I've incredible people who, again, we all fall victim to this stuff though. And so one of
Exactly.
the things, yeah, it's like I'm not saying anything bad about my partners. They're
No,
amazing. But
look, patriarchy is a system, not a person, right?
exactly. Thank you for that. Yeah. But one of the things that I found consistent across relationships when I'm in relationships with the opposite gender is that I am very attuned, as you said, to their needs. I can tell when they're having a bad day. I can kind of preempt certain sorts of like blow ups or arguments, and I can sort of be sensitive when I need to be sensitive. And I found that when I'm in a bad way, I almost have to wear it on my sleeve intentionally just to get the kind of feedback or attention that I need at that moment. Like I have to explicitly say, I am sad today and I need you to be sensitive towards me, or even apologize. I'm sorry, I'm just really sensitive today. Whereas I can preempt their sensitivities before they even they're like, no, I'm fine. I'm like, I don't think you're fine. Like you're acting like you're not fine. And then ultimately it comes out, no, this is what I'm dealing with at work. Like, is that consistent across our society?
I think so. I mean, it's interesting because one interpretation I read of that is because women have always had less power societally, for 150,000 years since the advent of emotionally modern humans, we've had to be more sensitive to to more powerful people around us. So, is this like an evolved trait? Is it a socialized trait? It's probably both. If you're the one who doesn't have any power, you better be checking out everything that's going on around you all the time to kind of be prepared. Um, and then we are also, girls are socialized and reinforced for being caring and considerate and paying attention to other people's needs. And I think my husband was the first man I ever lived with other than my father. Actually, I had a male roommate. Though that's interesting too, now that I'm thinking about that. But I would notice with my husband, and it became more apparent as we had kids that his needs so often, and I'll do the same caveating you're doing. My husband's a great father. My children adore him. He's totally involved with them. My husband is also a therapist. He's a sensitive guy, but I would just watch his needs come first almost all the time. We would get home and the kids would be tired and he would head straight into our bathroom to brush his teeth. And it was like, I could not think about that. Like we got home with two tired kids and I was getting them in their pajamas and ready for bed. And it was just things like that all the time. It was so disorienting to be sharing a home and a family with someone who, like, I could never think of putting my needs first. And I don't mean to elevate myself in saying this because there's something pathological about this too. But I think these are the gender roles, right? Are we the gender who thinks about our own needs first most of the time, or the gender who does not? So I think, neither position is sustainable, but watching my husband live this way was so disorienting to me because I didn't realize. And I think that's part of what male privilege is. And to see it up close was so weird. And now that I'm thinking about my male roommate, he used to, we both had dogs and he would stay at his girlfriend's house and not bother to like call me and say, can you walk the dog? He would just assume that I was going to do it and like take care of it. And he was a great roommate. I love this roommate. We're still friends. Great guy. Here's my caveat again. But when I'm thinking back, and we had a really easy roommate relationship because things are less intense somehow in male-female friendships sometimes than with women I had lived with. So it was actually a great, great roommate situation. But there were things like that I would notice. Like I never would have just expected him to walk my dog if I didn't ask.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. We have to caveat these things because, again, this is a social structure and we feel like, oh gosh, if I don't caveat these things, people are going to think that I'm being aggressive or I'm
Exactly.
attacking.
I'm being such a bitch, right?
I know. And I had this like massive experience during my last breakup where, again, together for a very long time, very supportive, loving, really still care about each other deeply. But one of those things where just our lives changed and we grew in different directions. And I remember, so when we broke up, we owned a home together. So it was a lot of work to like be bought out of the home, I bought myself a new home. It was the first time I'd ever done that. It was very empowering in a lot of ways, but it was also incredibly stressful and hard for me. And during the time, he bought me out of the house. So I got a lump sum. He came with me to go house hunting. He would go to the store with me to buy all the odds and ends that I needed for my new place. And when I would tell my friends about that, they would be like, he's so amazing. You're so lucky, blah, blah. And there was a moment where I was like, yes, don't get me wrong. He is amazing and I am lucky. But like, why is that our response? This is like what's expected. I would do this. I don't think we need to elevate it like he's got some fucking crown on his head for it. I appreciate it. But why are we so congratulatory when a guy is just like a good guy?
Right. And a lot of the mothers that I interviewed for the book would talk about this, and say, like, or there's the observation has been made, like, men get applauded for changing diapers and women do not get applauded for earning money. Like, no one ever says, oh, that's great that you're earning most of the money in your home. But oh my God, it's amazing that your ex boyfriend is thoughtful enough about your needs to help you look for a new home when he's getting your old one. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And then a lot of women I interviewed also would fall back on this idea of gratitude because when I solicited interview subjects for the book, I did it by saying, I went on Facebook mothers message boards because I wanted a geographical diversity, and said, hey, I'm working on this book. If you've had issues with this in your own relationship, I'd love to talk to you. So everyone I recruited was in the situation where they were frustrated. And so they would talk to me very colorfully and with a lot of energy about their frustrations. And then a lot of times they would walk it back and say, oh, but I'm really very lucky. He does so much more than other men. So this kind of position of gratitude worked to dissipate the anger that they were feeling. So I wonder if in a patriarchy, women, because of the anger they typically feel and can't like necessarily know about very easily, get to this, oh, you're so lucky, right? Like, instead of just like, yeah, men aren't usually that considerate, and doesn't that suck, and what are we going to do about it, and how can we all work together to change that? Instead you hear, oh, you're so lucky, right?
Yeah, because the goalposts are so shifted that yeah, and then that's like having salt in the wound. It's like, people who struggle with depression. I myself am one of them. I work with a lot of patients who struggle with depression, as I'm sure you do as well. One of the hardest things about depression is that you're sad and then you feel guilty on top of being sad for being sad and for it affecting your behavior negatively. And the guilt and the shame on top of the underlying layer of sadness and depression makes it like significantly worse. And so I think this is there's a parallel there with women who maybe were upset about something, but then we're told constantly how lucky we are that it makes us feel like we're not allowed to be upset about it when we have, decent partners.
I interviewed women whose husbands said to them, well, I do a lot more than other men, when they tried to raise the issue, as if that were an acceptable answer. But we live in systems that tell us that it is, and then we swallow our anger and feel guilty. Women would say to me, oh, I feel guilty talking about this. As if like expressing themselves and really just living with the reality of what it means to kind of exist in a sexist society it wasn't okay to acknowledge. We have to act as if that it weren't the case.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like as if the thing that's being unspoken is not even understood. That, like, yeah, that's why we are together. Like, I would not be with you if you were like abusing me. Like, I love you. We're talking about the issues beyond that.
Right. If you're with someone and they have feelings about something, it's part of your job as a partner to hear them out. But what I heard from people and experienced in my own marriage was that this was such a difficult topic, because men felt accused and bad, and women felt unheard, because when someone's feeling accused and bad, they're likely to be defensive and not open. And actually, one of the nice things I've heard from couples who have read my book together is that the book really allowed them to see that it wasn't their fault. Like, it wasn't her fault, it wasn't his fault, that outside forces had conspired to like put us in this situation. And if we want things to be different, how are we going to come together as a team to really do something about it? So it was really nice to hear that having all this information helped them really just think about ways to kind of proactively fix it, and by absolving them of responsibility for it in some ways.
Yeah, I'm wondering, based on all of the research that you've done and all the people that you've talked to, how hopeful you really are. And I not to like bring like a dark cast on this, but I ask that with a short kind of anecdote about a dear friend of mine who recently got married, and they became pregnant and they had a child. She became pregnant. I'm a little closer to the husband, but they had a child and they decided that they wanted to raise this child in like a somewhat gender neutral way. They didn't want to be precious about it, but they were like, we're not going to tell you the gender. We're not going to gender the child if we can help it. You know, some days they dress it very girly, some days they dress it very boyish. They call it because it's still a baby. Sometimes they call her she, sometimes they call him he. And they always say, we're not trying to be weird about it. If you want to know the biological sex, like, change a diaper and you'll know, like, you're welcome to that. You know, you want to help out, come change a diaper. But ultimately, we just really don't want everybody around us to gender our child because of how we dress them or treat them until they're old enough to start making those kinds of decisions. And I don't think for them it's about, oh, we're trying to induce having a trans baby. I think for them it's like, no, we just want this kid to have every opportunity available, and we don't want any of the stereotyping that happens at a young age to affect them negatively in their development. But I think the funny thing is, and the reason I bring this up is because the response to this, even from my friends, some of my friends who are incredibly progressive and educated and living in LA and blah, blah, is like an eye roll. It's like oh my God, what are they doing? Like, oh, they're so forward thinking. And like they almost laugh at it as if it's some sort of like ludicrous idea that these parents, who I think are trying to do something really good for their kid in a society that's very sick in this way, people literally shame them.
Wow. Yeah, we're so judgmental. Yeah, I guess it's easy to be judgmental. There's a book that I read in doing my research called An Unconventional Family by a psychologist who's not alive anymore, but her name is Sandra Bem. Her name was Sandra Bem. And she and her husband decided to raise their kids in the 70s in really gender neutral ways. And they didn't call their kids it, I don't think, when they were babies. And they just tried to have this gender free household because they didn't like the word sexism wasn't around yet. In fact, they called it sexual racism because there wasn't a word for sexism. This was in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, 70s. Yeah. So what they found was that the sort of gender ideas of the world were so permeated their environment outside of their home that of course their children were still impacted. So when you ask me about my optimism, I do think that, I've gotten such a great response to this book, and part of the great response has been from men who send me emails saying, "I always knew this was true. I didn't have a way to articulate it. Thank you for giving this to me because I really want to do better." So I get emails like that, and there is some hope. But I feel like no matter what we do in our homes, the world around us is like our ideas about gender are so baked in that I think it's really hard. I think, again, the best bet is for couples to decide to live really consciously about what we believe. And I don't mean like our on top beliefs, as some sociologists have called them, but like the underneath beliefs, the more implicit ones that we don't articulate, how those are going to affect us. So I think, the reason that I wrote this book was I feel like if we can become more conscious of this stuff, we can make different choices. So I really wrote the book that I felt would have been quite helpful for me to have when I embarked on parenthood and my husband, so we could make more conscious choices about this stuff. So it wouldn't have been something that colored in a kind of negative way the earliest years of our kids' lives, which are really always going to be incredibly hard as well as incredibly joyful. But we could have gotten along a lot better for a number of years if we had been really aware of what was going to go down. So I hope that, if enough people read this, that, some people are relieved of this way of living and we can, make different choices. Again, the more we know, I think the better off we are.
So I would love to know like what some of those choices might be and some of the topics that you really did dig into in the book. You know, we mentioned pay gaps. We mentioned like sort of quote unquote domestic duties, just general child rearing or child care duties. But what are some of the specific things that really do fundamentally differ in traditional or even quite progressive and modern homes where there is one man and one woman? And sorry to also interject. Did you only really focus on heterosexual couples where both parents are still in the home?
Yes. So, because the book is about sexism in romantic relationships, I necessarily focused on heterosexual couples. I did also interview some gay couples just to have like a sense of comparison, but that wasn't the bulk of what I was doing. So, yes, I was looking at dual career couples. Who remain together while child rear, dual career heterosexual couples who are together. Yeah, that was like the thrust of it, because that was, that was kind of what I was trying to solve for. Like, why is this?
Every time I ask you a question, I have like 10 more questions. Hold that thought. Hold the thought about what some of the differences are, because I do want to dive into that. When you compared, like just as your means for comparison, did you see big differences between gay couples?
I would hate to make broad pronouncements based on a handful of interviews with gay couples. There's a little bit of research. There is some research that suggests that of all gendered configurations of couples, lesbians co parent most harmoniously. That finding really stayed with me. For one thing, because there is not a ton of research on gay couples and child rearing and division of labor. But second, because it made a kind of intuitive sense. And I'll explain to you what I mean. One of the lesbian couples that I interviewed said to me, one of the women in this couple said to me, I I give a lot of thought to what my partner has had on her plate in any given day or week. And I know if she's been picking up a lot of slack with the kids, I will come home and make dinner and clean it up. Like, I'm always in my mind balancing out our labor. Um, and then one of the gay men that I interviewed said to me, we have the same problems as heterosexual couples, in terms of mutuality and really thinking about each other. And it was so interesting doing these two interviews kind of back to back, because the woman was saying to me, my partner and I think about each other and what's been going on, and we try to balance the scales. And this man saying to me, we kind of have trouble thinking about each other. And I thought, that's it right there, right? And in heterosexual couples, what I heard from a lot of people, and I know I do this, like, I think about what's been going on. And like, if I'm away for the weekend, on the rare occasion that happens, I come home and I take over, because I feel like I have to balance out the scales, because my husband has had all this on him for like 2 days straight. Um, and I heard from a lot of women that they think that way, and that their partners didn't necessarily succeed in acting as if they were, thinking that way and then behaving in that way. So I think when we think about gender and the way boys are raised versus the way girls are raised, it makes sense then that lesbians would co-parent most harmoniously.
Yeah, and almost that anecdotal kind of interview that you got from the lesbian couple and the gay couple, it really, I think, puts on the platter kind of this issue of privilege, of male privilege that we've been talking about. And I'm not saying that to denigrate. It's just it's true. Like they almost, yeah, really exemplified what privilege is right there.
Yes, not needing to think about the other. And it's what you were talking about when you said, you were really attuned to your partner's mood, and that you had to, and, there's nothing wrong with needing to communicate verbally. Like, we need to do that as human beings. But your partner was less attuned to you and wasn't thinking about you as much. You had to ask for it more. And again, I think there are, these differences in how we're raised and not in biology. Really, that's where they leave us in heterosexual relationships.
Okay, so other quick question before we get into the other meat. Because you're interviewing mostly heterosexual couples that both have careers and that co-parent and live together and are married, did how many people did you really talk to that have older children? I mean, like, that's rare, right? That people just stay married.
Oh, no, I don't think it's rare. I
Oh,
think people
really?
slog through this. Absolutely. So I found one study that said division of labor was the third cited reason for divorce after adultery and growing apart. So, I definitely heard from women who I got emails from women who said, this is why I got divorced. And I'm so glad I did it, because my life is so much easier now. Even though I'm a single parent, at least I'm not mad at somebody else for not doing anything, even though I have to do everything now myself. But yeah, no, I did. I talked to people with teenagers for sure. I made it my business to talk to people with kids, still kids in the home, but all along the age spectrum. And the people with teenagers were more mad about, like, historically what had gone down than what was happening in the present. So now that the kids were like pretty independent, It was more like the memory of the anger and how it impacted them than like a lot of active anger about what was going on now. Though, again, it's just because there are less needs to be met, not because there was some more egalitarian way that had been achieved. It was just like, well, we don't do that stuff anymore. So there's less on my plate. I'm still the one making dinner all the time if I want the family to have healthy food. I would hear things like that.
Makes sense. So that right there is a good example of the original question that I wanted to dive into, which is like the kind of stuff that maybe people reading the book we hope will gain an awareness of, because I think it's a puzzle. It's a lot of things together that have a gestalt to them, which is just like being more aware. But you have to start with the pieces of the puzzle before you start to see the image. And so, is it things like cooking, or is it things like trying to understand somebody's needs before they have to verbalize them? Like, what are the kinds of things that women generally said that they were like really resentful about?
Well, certainly it's the being the kind of default parent. So when there's anything that isn't explicitly discussed and divided, the implicit assumption is that the mother is going to take care of it. Mothers are there to be imposed on, and fathers not so much. So the default parenting position is something that a lot of women had a hard time with. The mental load, the mental labor, as it's been called, is another thing, like knowing who needs to go to the doctor when, knowing when the shoes are getting too small, knowing that the class party is coming up and that XYZ has to be brought in. My daughter needs a tutor right now. My younger one's having trouble in math. Like, I know, like my husband, like I was struggling to do it. My husband was like, do you want me to take over? And I was like, yeah. And I forwarded him the list, and like, I know he hasn't made the call. So it's like still on my mind that I have to remind him, right? So it's not just the doing of the stuff, which is an issue, but it's also the thinking and the planning. And it was interesting to read the sociologists who had done home studies. For example, her name is escaping me. She wrote, Annette Lareau, she wrote a book called Race, Class, and Family Life, I think it was. And she wasn't writing about gender, but I interviewed her and she told me that like the gender division of labor was something that stood out to her so much as she was doing like this study, which was really on families and race and class privilege. She ended up writing a separate paper called My Wife Can Tell You Who I Know, because she found in interviewing fathers that they knew like so little about their kids' lives, and it really stunned her. And she would go into homes where they said to her, oh yeah, dad does all the sports. But then she would be there on a day that a soccer game was rained out and the mother was fielding all the phone calls and making sure the uniforms were ready and the snacks were ready. But she said, these people were so blinded by their ideology, their progressive ideology, that they would just say, oh no, dad does all the sports, and not acknowledge like all the invisible labor that went into signing the kids up and making sure they had all their equipment and their uniforms. And again, providing the snacks for the team or whatever the parents are responsible for. So I guess like physical labor, default parenting, and mental labor would be the things that that women were frustrated by. And with the mental labor, they would speak specifically about their husbands having no idea about kind of what went on behind the scenes and all the things that they were thinking of. So women, when they become parents, there's some work that shows that they feel as if they should be thinking about their child all of the time. Again, this is sociology, and they do interviews in much the same way journalists do, sociologists, in qualitative research. And men do not, when they've become fathers, feel that they should be thinking about their children all of the time. And this has a lot to do with the different pressures that are on men and women societally in terms of what roles they're valued for and traditionally occupy.
So, I mean, it seems like, we obviously have a long way to go. And before we do like the closeout portion of the episode, I would love to know, I'm going to ask you like kind of the most annoying question that I'm sure journalists ask you all the time when you're doing coverage for your book.
I already know what it's going to be. Tell me.
Oh, really?
No, I'm
Ooh,
kidding. Tell
wait,
me
okay.
if I guessed right.
Is there anything when you were doing all of your research that like you really didn't know before you dove into it? Because a lot of this seems confirmatory, right? Like we kind of already knew it, but like really now we know the extent of it. Or like, those of us who are hip to this are like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But is there anything where you were like, holy shit, I had no idea?
Cara, that's a great question. No one has asked me that.
Oh, okay.
I
It's
won't
like
tell you
that
what
book
I thought.
surprised me the most. What? No, tell me what you thought. Tell me what you thought.
I thought, well, people are like, so have you solved this problem in your relationship now? Which is a totally valid question. And I understand why people are asking. And I always feel like the answer should be yes. But the answer is still like totally no. So,
Yeah, those people aren't therapists, though.
I think we got off on like once you get off on the wrong foot, I think it's hard to reverse course, and there's a lot of work in that in itself, and we're tired.
I also don't know if this is something that is going to ever be solved. I think it's something that you're just constantly working
Yeah,
on.
it is right, exactly. Equality is not an endpoint, but a process. But I will say, I didn't know any of this when I started writing, and I mean, I guess I knew like that there was like a gendered labor thing in the home. Like I kind of vaguely knew that. But I will say, the first chapter of the book is about biology and our misunderstandings about biology and how because like I would say to people, why do you think this is? And one of the answers I would get from people would be biology. So it turns out that, and I can't believe I didn't know this and that everybody doesn't know this because it's like just like well documented. Did you know that men's hormones change when they spend time in intimate contact with a pregnant woman?
Oh, well, I know that there's like some of that kind of pregnancy sensitivity stuff that happens, like their actual behavior and cognitions can change. I would assume there's some hormonal influence there.
Right. So I didn't know this. The same hormones that rise in women during pregnancy rise in their partners. Now, again, it's about intimate contact. So if you get a woman pregnant as a result of a one night stand and you never see her again, your hormones don't rise. But if you spend time in close contact during during pregnancy, like prolactin, oxytocin. I'm going to get it wrong because I'm not that kind of scientist. Like all those hormones rise in men. So I didn't know that. But men are biologically primed to parent in the same ways that women are. So that was something I didn't know. And I also learned that there is no such literal thing as a maternal instinct. Both men and women are wired to be attracted to small, helpless creatures. This is partly why we like puppies and dogs, right? Because we're kind of like like society would not have. Our human beings would not continue to exist if we didn't get something emotionally out of taking care of small creatures who can't care for themselves, right? The human race would have died out. So this is
pretty much
true.
all mammals. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Although humans stay attached to their offspring for much longer than other mammals, dogs apparently don't even recognize their offspring if they're separated from them for a while. Like I always felt so bad about taking my puppies from their mothers. And then I thought, oh, but not all mammals work the same way, but primates seem to work this way. So there's no such thing as a maternal instinct. Again, parental love is innate. There's an innate component to it, clearly. There's an innate component to most of what we do. But parenting skills are learned and not innate for men as well as women. And it's really about learning and like learning by doing repeatedly. And because of the way our society is structured, women do spend much more time in intimate contact with their babies, especially early on, than men because of the way work is structured. And then the learning curve is so different for each just because of the time invested. And people kind of say, well, it's instinct and men just aren't as good at it. And none of that is like biologically true.
And also it's insulting because it's like when somebody, works their ass off to get a PhD and then they go, oh, well, you're just really smart. And you're like, no, I worked my ass off.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yes.
Give me a little bit of credit here.
Right. Human beings actually don't survive based on instincts. We have a neocortex. We rely on learning, which allows a lot of flexibility in adapting to environments, but it also means that most of what we do is not automatic and a lot of learning is required. And parenting is certainly one of those things.
Good to know, because I always wondered if I was broken in that way, because I love babies. My friends' babies are so cute and I love to poke them. I just don't want to have one.
It's funny because I never liked kids all that much. I always wanted a family, but it wasn't because I loved being around children. It wasn't until I had my own that something really did shift, and you kind of like feel the biology at work. And now I'm like, I love kids, my friends' kids. I love having relationships with them. So something definitely changed in me, and I think it is like neurobiological for men and women both, not just for me because I'm a woman. And now I kind of like I love kids now, and that really shifted when I had them.
That's amazing and also very important because you are a mother.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very important. But when people say like, "Oh, I'm not really interested in kids. I don't want them." I mean, I think that's a perfectly fine life decision. Don't get me wrong. But I'm sometimes compelled to say to people, like, if I have a patient who says that, well, it really does feel different when it is your own kid.
Yeah, I know if I had a kid, I would be super attached to it. But I also know that cognitively, I don't want to put myself in that
Yeah, I mean,
position.
look, there's no reason to. The world has plenty of people. In fact, we could probably do better if there were less people, and that seems to be the way we might be going. But there's a ton of stuff that surprised me, actually. Like all the studies I found, I didn't realize how quantified the division of labor had been by like family researchers. So I would say like so much of what I learned, just that there was research and like studies on it was all totally surprising. There was a really interesting workplace study that shows that men behave the same way relative to women in the office as they do in the home. So women end up doing much more of the scut work of the office place than men. So they're just like, there were so many interesting studies. I could have gone on researching this book for years and it would have been like 1,000 pages, but luckily I had a deadline. So that will not be inflicted upon me or anybody else.
Well, and that's why it's so important that, people like yourself exist who are good kind of popularizers of this information because like you said, it does exist, but people just don't know it.
Exactly. I know there's so much interesting research in sociology, but unless you're an academic sociologist or a social psychologist, you're not likely to come upon it. So that's one of the things that I love being able to accomplish with my journalism. And I hope I didn't do a disservice to any of their studies because sometimes they're, complicated. But yeah, that was part of what I wanted to do, kind of get this information that's only in academia out there so that people have it.
And of course, guys, that information is all contained in All the Rage, Mothers, Fathers, and the Myth of Equal Partnership. Darcy, I know you got to go feed your kids, but before you do, I close every episode with the same 2 questions. And I'm wondering if I would love to hear your perspective on these questions because as a psychotherapist, I really do think, just like you mentioned earlier, you were inspired by your therapist because therapists really think about the world in kind of a different way. And so I'm very interested in your take on these. Big picture, however you want to slice it, whatever you want to answer. Number 1, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night that, when you think about the future, you feel like you're like maybe pessimistic, maybe cynical, like things aren't looking good. What are you really worried about? And on the flip side, when you think about the future, what are you like genuinely optimistic about? And I mean like authentically, not like lip service.
Yeah, no. Well, look, at a really micro way, I'm really concerned about where our country is politically and that disinformation and dishonest media are allowing our country to fall prey to just a really horrible time. I mean, as we record this, the impeachment hearings were this week and the facts are so clear and hearing the Republicans spin them, I find so disturbing. I wish they would just say, we don't, he's done these things. We don't care. We don't want Elizabeth Warren to be president. Like that would just, a more honest dialogue would make me a lot less anxious, at least own it. So that is keeping me up at night, seriously. And then in a more macro way, climate change is keeping me up at night. In fact, sometimes I feel like, why am I bothering with gender equity? Like we all need to be focused on climate change. Like the planet is. So yeah, that's pretty that's pretty dark. But if you're asking what's keeping me up at night, of course, fears about my children's safety. I think as every parent, we live in I don't know. I guess I won't go into that, but of course, like, I want my kids to live long, happy, healthy lives. So that is every parent's concern. So that's what's keeping me up at night. What was the second question?
On the flip side of that, so we kind of end on more of a positive note. What are you excited about?
Well, from what I understand, if you step back a little, the world is actually in a much better place than it's ever been. Like globally, poverty is down. Social justice movements in this country and elsewhere have had some success. Gay people can get married in the United States legally. The arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards social justice, right? I think I didn't mess up that MLK quote. So that, I mean, there are vaccines, there are treatments for disease. So I think those things are all really optimistic, and it can be hard to hold on to that stuff when one is worried about climate change. But there is also that.
Agreed. That's all I can say. Agreed. Darcy, thank you so much. This has been such an informative chat. I think such an important chat. The good news, too, is that the Talk Nerdy audience This is another kind of issue that I struggle with, but because we are a kind of more of a hard science podcast, and because podcasting itself has a little bit of a gender bend to it, my audience is like 75% male. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the reception and the interest and because I think that's a group that obviously, um, uh, hopefully that this kind of information is maybe a little bit new. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. Guys, the book is all the rage, Mothers, Fathers, and the Myth of Equal Partnership. Darcy, thank you so much for joining me this week.
Oh, Cara, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.